Well, I think on a practical level, I mean, two things that are very relevant to this that certainly were presented in my psychosynthesis training and stay with me. I'm sure lots of things that don't. As a very practical thing, I have to say I don't consciously specifically do this with every client, although I do consciously specifically do it with some clients, but the training probably was to do it with every client, which is when the client comes into the room, when you sit down, it can be, it's a little moment inside, it's not something the client has to be aware of at all, but a moment of inviting the client's deepest, innermost self to be present. Now, whether that actually has any effect, of course, I would question on an intellectual level, but on an experiential level, I know that can be really helpful. And I think in that's where perhaps, you know, working for years of experience comes into it in a way. I don't even have to think about that or put it into practice with every client. But when I do, it's really useful to do. So if we come to a training level, I think that's a really important thing. It's some way to encourage, to train people to incorporate that. And then allied with that in psychosynthesis, it's called bifocal vision, which is to, you know, you're working with the personality with the person, but the bifocal vision is you're holding the presence of the self at all times. They're subtle things because it's not like, you know, I'm getting you to do some Gestalt dialoguing or whatever, which is not subtle. I mean, it's very, you know, can be very emotional and real and present in the room. And there are some clients I certainly wouldn't, many clients I wouldn't dream of mentioning any of that to them because, and yet for students training, I'd almost want to make it, I'm perhaps going too far, but I kind of feel like now, as we're talking about it now, anyway, I'd want to make it a requirement. I think it's important. I've played about with the notion of trifocal vision, and I thought this was a good idea. When actually it doesn't really work as a great idea, but you know, where you're holding the deepest innermost self and the personality and the darkest sort of deepest pit aspects of the person. But actually you don't need to do that because the bifocal vision does it anyway. You know, why create a another duality out of it? I mean, the main model used in psychosynthesis is the psychosynthesis egg diagram, which seems very simple initially to people, and yet the more you go into it, the more there is. It's a brilliant invention, whatever, as I showed this, and you know, as the diagram is drawn, do you know the psychosynthesis?
Yes, the Sagittarius egg.
There's a little kind of star at the top, which is the self, and there's a little line from the star that comes down to the centre of the egg, where, so, you know, there's the big one universal self, and then we each have our own little piece of that self at centre, at core, at heart. But what's really important in training for people is for them to recognise that star at the top of, you know, the universal self isn't a transcendent function out there. It's put at the top, but it could be put anywhere on the periphery of the egg. It's in the depths of the darkness as well as in the heights. So that's where I think, you know, if we're just words really, but if we're talking about this in terms of, you know, transcendent functions and things, I think that's not quite the right way to go about it. It's not transcendent. It is transcendent, and at the same time it is equally, and probably more importantly, immanent as well. It's here, it's present. You know. So that's what's important in a training. Probably, well, no, I would say definitely, really, much more important than the. If I go back to my principles and relationship techniques, the techniques part is, you know, I mean, of course, and trainings often want those things. You know, I want to know what to do. What do I do? You know. But what do? You sit back, and you be with yourself, and you allow that presence to be there. You be with the relationship. You hold those deeper, important principles, and then the techniques just come. You know, you can learn those. Whereas I think, you know, I think certainly some trainings I've worked on in the past, I think probably all trainings on some level get caught up into the techniques part of it, the methods, what are you going to do.
Yeah, and the bits to know. So it becomes, this is the right way of doing things, and that's really. I think, I mean, it's really helpful you saying that, because I think, maybe I'm just kind of smiling because I like what you're saying there, but it feels like that this is also one area that actually can easily get sidelined or become part of that idea of, if you do this, then you will get better results, kind of thing. In other words, it's a bit of a technique, like, okay, now I just hold, I hold this part of the client, and, that kind of, so it becomes a process that's about achieving a goal at the end of it, when it's subtly not that, isn't it?
There's a phrase from, or a quote, I don't remember the exact quote, it's from William James. This isn't the exact quote, but he says something like, when you can hear the machinery of the will in process, it's not really the will.
Right.
And that's what we're talking here, isn't it, I think? Or from the Western mystery tradition, a phrase sometimes used is delivered from the lust of result. Right. Will needs to not have. Once you're lusting after a result, it becomes partial. It's not. We're not unified or not one. Then, because one of my personalities, Will, says, I'm a therapist and I'm going to heal you.
Yeah. It's, and I must remember that. That's a lovely sentence, isn't it? Delivered from the lust of result, and particularly at this time, in therapy, where with evidence-based stuff, which is all about results, tangible, measurable. Whether that can be true, results.
I think that's. I could go off on one here, because I think it's really, really important that one can measure things, and I can be quite empirical about that at times. But what we're talking about here is something, and I think a lot of the. It's very easy for people to take evidence out of context, or make it more than it is. I mean, all the CBT stuff, they can prove. But as the years go by now, we start seeing that a lot of that proving apparently doesn't really prove anything, and in fact isn't necessarily as effective as it appeared to be, etc., etc.